everyone. Welcome to the final episode of 2020. I thought I'd use this as an opportunity to do a kind of solo episode in which I take a look back at the year, the kind of conversations I've had, the projects I've been working on, and just offer some kind of reflections on those. So I won't be, just recapping all the kind of global news or anything like that. It's going to be very much to do with the content you guys have been paying attention to. So if we start in January of 2020, back then I wasn't doing a podcast. I was doing kind of these solo episodes in which I was trying to kind of lay out my worldview. I spent almost a year doing that, trying to kind of just have a bunch of videos that catalogued my perspective before leaping into these kinds of conversations. And I'm really glad I did that. And I'd like to return to those at some point as well. Every now and then I have kind of things that I think would be interesting to do to camera like that, but I've not been recording them. There's been a lot of work getting the podcast up and going. But in 2021, maybe I'll do that if there's interest there. Also, back then I was doing live streams, which I was really enjoying. They were really great. It was wonderful to interact with you all and got excellent questions. But then where I am now in Portugal with satellite Wi-Fi, it wasn't really feasible. You can look at my last few ones, especially there's one on free will, and the quality was pretty bad. If we can improve that, then I'd love to do those again. So also in January, personally, there was and also, in this kind of public facing work I'm doing, it's relevant. We bought the land that I'm on now in Portugal, the Surrender Homestead. And that's obviously relevant to me, but also to you all, because we'll be opening to people. People can probably come in 2022. Pandemic, I'm sure, will still be going for most of 2021, and that gives us an opportunity to finish construction on a lot of the accommodation. Then we'd love to have people visit, hopefully then. And also another relevant thing is I did my first ayahuasca retreat, which was incredibly powerful. I recorded a video about it, which was probably my most popular video ever. It was very, very personal, not pulling any punches on the kind of, on the kind of healing work that happened there. And every now and then I am struck by the kind of night and day quality of how I was relating to those issues before the ayahuasca retreat and since. It's usually when people talk about psychedelic medicine, there's a kind of emphasis on don't expect this to solve all your problems. Don't expect everything to go away, which is wise. But for me, it really solved it. It really, at least since that. The psychedelics are a catalyst, and there's a lot of day-to-day work that goes into the kind of healing work, and I've been doing a huge amount in the year leading up to that. Every now and then I'm struck by the fact that those issues I discuss in that video just aren't issues anymore. It really seemed to go to the core of this, probably like the kind of earliest, most fundamental wound in infancy, and produce a kind of cathartic experience that really kind of, tied a bow on it and was like, okay, like that's wrapped up now. Again, there was a lot of other stuff, a lot of other work outside of the ayahuasca retreat that goes into that, and I'll be talking in the new year. I'm hoping to talk to people about just kind of general emotional health, stuff like that, because it's incredible to go from, in my teens and 20s, really struggling with mental health issues, to just not struggling with them anymore, and to just feeling good. I feel like a different person to who I was before I tried psychedelic medicine, and everything that goes along with that in terms of understanding emotional health. I'm hoping to talk more about that stuff, and it's nice to take a moment just to reflect on just how astounding the healing that can happen with ayahuasca and other psychedelic medicine is. And that was with Wheeler and Tamara of Ayahuasca Spirit Europe, who are incredible. They just are a really safe pair of hands. Really, I have a huge amount of respect for them. I only heard good things from other people as well. I was put in touch with them by Rob from Adeptus Psychonautica. So thanks, Rob, if you're watching, listening. It was really powerful. I'm really, really, really glad I did that. So then in February, that was, I think, the last time I was in London, actually. I was, the plan was to split my time between Portugal and London, because I still work there. But then the pandemic hit, and that was the last time I was in London. March, we actually moved on to the land here. We were kind of staying in Airbnb before in Portugal while we were looking for the land, and a camper van before that. Yeah, so we installed solar panels, got satellite Wi-Fi, so it meant we could actually be here full time. Bought a huge bell tent, which we've been living in since March now, which is I actually quite like it. It's not as uncomfortable as one might think. It's spacious enough for like a log fire and a bed and everything, normal furniture. We weren't planning to be in it for a full year, which is looking like we will be. So I'm sure by March I'll be glad to move into the house that I'm recording this in now. It has a roof, but it doesn't have doors and windows at the moment, so not really livable. But construction's coming along well for that. So yeah, we moved on to land. Then April, I guess it was around then the pandemic was really getting, we were seeing that it was going to be something very serious. I can't remember exactly when lockdown started here. We were spending our time on the land anyway, so it happened very gradual for us. We weren't as tuned into the news as other people. So I also remember feeling during those first weeks where it felt quite apocalyptic and people didn't know how serious it was going to be, and people were kind of buying up toilet paper and everything, and these kind of crazy queues at supermarkets. We felt astoundingly lucky that a matter of weeks earlier we'd moved on to this land where the idea was to be self-sufficient. We grow our own food, we have our own water supply from a well. It really felt like a kind of we didn't come out here to be kind of apocalyptic preppers, but it did feel kind of that if society were to collapse, that this is a better position to be in than being in London, I guess. So then May, it was around then that I guess a lot of career stuff started changing. I started writing for Reality Sandwich weekly, which has been great. Construction started kind of accelerating on the house. I started doing the Ask Me Anythings instead of live streams, which have been really wonderful. I really, really appreciate those questions. And I'm constantly, it's so great, the quality of them, because it's not only that they're really good, from like the perspective of asking, an audience on YouTube or of a podcast for questions, but they're of a higher standard than the conversations I might have in an academic setting, around these things, because a lot of people aren't interested in systems thinking and psychedelic medicine and consciousness. So yeah, it's really, I couldn't ask for better questions. And then obviously at the end of May, we had the killing of George Floyd and other African Americans by the police in America and the Black Lives Matter protests, which is something I addressed in my writing for Reality Sandwich, but I intentionally didn't address on the YouTube platform. And I made that decision because I feel like, I have a place to have my, to say my piece, my thoughts on that in my writing. But with YouTube and podcasting, I feel like, especially YouTube, it's so geared towards kind of political argumentation and conflict for the sake of conflict that doesn't lead anywhere fruitful. And that is really not to my taste. So anyway, I'll be talking to people who are far more knowledgeable and have lived experience with this stuff. But yeah, I want to make sure I do it right. And you can read my writing if you want to see more about what I think about that. Okay, so by June, that was when, I'd launched the podcast. I think, I launched it in June, and the Black Lives Matter protests really got going around then. And yeah, I spoke about my theory for the first time in public, and it was published later in the year. And then that's when I got started with the podcast. And for the rest of the year, I won't go through month by month, because I think the conversations I had are the main thing of interest. There are no other kind of huge changes, I think, in this work I've been doing. So yeah, if I go through episode by episode with my guests and just reflect on why I had them on, the topics we spoke about, how I see them interconnecting, hopefully that'll be of interest. So my first guest was John Horgan, which was great. So he's a kind of very established journalist at Scientific American. yeah, we spoke about, I think we have similar worldview or similar interests in terms of science and kind of mysticism, and especially, psychedelic mysticism as well. So we spoke about the mind-body problem, the hard problem of consciousness. He had an interesting take that was kind of like that because the solutions we come up with are they're kind of like radically subjective. Like I'll have one story that makes me feel good, you'll have another one, and he was kind of arguing that you can never really come to the truth because of that. I don't think that's like a philosophical block to coming to the truth. I think it's a challenge, but I do think there's an objective answer, and unsurprisingly, I think it's my answer. Yeah, and then it was great talking to him about psychedelics and trying to kind of integrate these kind of wild experiences, especially the more interactive relational ones, instead of the mystical unitive ones. I see as being quite easy to square with science, but the ones where you feel like you're relating to some god or something, we both were kind of, he expressed this as well. It's nice to talk to someone where you're like, oh yeah, you had that crazy experience as well, because to the average person you sound it can be kind of alienating to talk to someone who's had a kind of crazy DMT experience, and it just sounds like they've lost their mind if you've never tried that kind of thing. So yeah, I think we both enjoyed that. Yeah, and then I had on Donald Hoffman, which was great. It's it's been a very popular episode. I wanted to talk to other people about consciousness. I didn't want to just kind of put forward my theory and say, I'm definitely right, just trust me. And, I wanted to talk to people who I respect and who have differing ideas. One of the things I think I'll talk about a lot here is the extent to which I've given a lot of space for people who believe consciousness is fundamental, or only consciousness exists, this kind of philosophical idealist perspective. I've never had that perspective myself. I've never been convinced by it. But there are intelligent people who are, and so I was unsure as to whether to get on as many guests as I did to talk about that subject, because it can kind of I don't know. It's weird to give a lot of time to an idea you don't agree with, but I think a lot of people in this space are interested in this idea and are convinced by it. And so I partly wanted to kind of open myself up to it and say, well, am I missing something? In the end, I didn't change my mind. But yeah, but at the same time, I feel like now a lot of my audience, or there's a large contingent who do take this perspective and don't agree with me on the kind of core issue of consciousness. And if you're one of them, yeah, welcome. I'm glad to have everyone in the audience. But yeah, I wonder to the extent at which I'm almost intentionally cultivating an audience who doesn't agree with me. So maybe I don't know, I'll bounce out with some scientists or something. But again, a lot of them I disagree with in being kind of too materialistic. A lot of comments. I'm always pleasantly surprised when people comment, or I like it when, the other day I got a comment that said something about enjoying my perspective being not materialistic and not idealistic in terms of the philosophical position of only consciousness existing. And I was glad that was kind of recognized, because I get a lot of comments just calling me a materialist, not in a derogatory way, usually a kind of compliment of, saying like it's nice to hear an idealist talking to a materialist. But I think, you could say I'm a materialist and that my worldview does line up with mainstream science, but I do think there's a kind of lazy version of materialism that gets thrown around a lot that I don't ascribe to, where matter is some kind of substance. I think matter is a way of talking about the parts of the world that we can both measure, that exist in between us, and the reality is a kind of process. So the label materialist doesn't really, sit that well with me. But that's partly because I don't think it's really possible to say what reality is made of, so no label would really sit well with me. So yeah, then I had on Christoph Koch, speaking of scientists studying consciousness, and he's arguably the person who founded the field of scientific study of consciousness with Francis Crick. One of the first books I read in this area as a teenager was Francis Crick's book, The Astonishing Hypothesis. The astonishing hypothesis being that the brain creates consciousness. And it's funny to kind of, with conversations about consciousness now, as it's moved on over the last few decades, there's a lot of talk about panpsychism, idealism, and in my view, the brain doesn't create consciousness. Consciousness exists as this kind of, when reality interacts with itself in a certain way, it's a kind of, it evokes this dynamic of attempting to know. And so if you look back now, and the whole point of the book is, isn't it astonishing to think that the brain could, this like lump of meat could generate consciousness? I feel like a lot of people read that now would be like, well, yeah, that is an astonishing hypothesis, because it's wrong. It's not like, that would be weird if consciousness was like a gas that came off of this meat. So yeah, but not to be too critical of Francis Crick. I probably wouldn't be able to talk about consciousness as a scientist if it wasn't for the work that he did pushing this stuff forward. We also touched on panpsychism, integrated information theory from Giulio Tononi. Actually, I've been the General Entropy, which has some really wonderful papers on consciousness and physics. They've invited me to write an article comparing my kind of claims to integrated information theory, and I kind of want to. They're doing a special episode, special issue on integrated information theory, and I think my thinking is I want it to be about, what can you say consciousness is? What can you say it's equivalent to? In my case, it's this kind of belief of interdependent framework of beliefs. It's kind of equivalent to a process. It's not a thing. In integrated information theory, it's kind of these kinds of causal dynamics inside the system. So yeah, that's what I'll be working on in January and February. Hopefully you'll see that in 2021. So then we had Bernardo Castro, speaking of idealists, who's incredibly influential in the psychedelic space. A huge number of people really stand behind his ideas. And he argues them very, very well. And I don't agree with his perspective, but we had a really wonderful conversation, probably my longest episode. Really pleasant conversation. And Bernardo he's a very good debater, I guess. Like he at the end we spoke about psychedelics, and he was making some very big claims about the effects of psychedelics on the brain, effectively disproving materialism. The material, can't. The idea of the brain is kind of important in generating, or is associated with consciousness in some important way. Doesn't stand up to the data of brain scans of psychedelics, and that's a big claim that I don't think is justified, but he argues so forcefully. I wasn't a theme here is that I'm not interested in debate in the sense of me being like, I have to have my position heard, and there's a lot of time and space in these podcasts to have conversations like that, have people ask questions in AMAs, do things like this. I see a lot of podcasts where the host really has to get their point across, and I really intentionally wanted to not do that. I kind of trust that I've got all the time in the world to communicate my ideas, and if I'm having someone on because I think they're interesting, I should give them the space to make their points, instead of kind of shut them down or trample over certain points. But that is part of the inspiration for me doing this episode, because I think perhaps I do that. Perhaps I should push back a bit more, because I don't know if anyone's left confused as to what I think the truth of the situation is. Maybe that's not what you care about. Maybe I shouldn't be so worried if what people think I come away with from the conversation. So then we had Shamash Aldina talking about mindfulness, which was great. I have this very strong instinct when it comes to you thinking about things and communicating ideas, to start from absolute basics, start from assuming no knowledge. Now, mindfulness is everywhere these days. I assume most of you are familiar to some extent with it as a concept. And, even if I was talking to people who weren't interested in psychedelic spirituality, consciousness, any of this stuff, they've probably, done 10 minutes of mindfulness at some point in their lives. So you may think it's unnecessary to kind of start from basics there, but I'm really glad we did. I think you can always learn something by going back to absolute basics and really thinking about, well, what is this? Why are we talking about it? Why is it relevant? And that's something I really learned as a university lecturer. When you have to teach 18-year-olds who are coming in to do neuroscience or psychology, and they know, most of them haven't done any, studying of that before. They've maybe done biology and chemistry or whatever. And they really, need to be taught the absolute basics. It can be some of the most kind of, some real insight can come from basically being like, okay, this is a neuron, this is a brain cell, this is how it works. Because people can ask you questions that suddenly make you kind of, these things are the kind of the foundational building blocks for how you think about whatever the system is you're studying, and the brain in this case. And then it can really help you clarify your thinking or potentially push you in new, exciting directions if you reassess those fundamentals. A lot of fundamentals in most fields, sometimes there are things that just haven't been proven, that are just kind of assumed. And then if you can do that experiment that proves it after a century of everyone just assuming it, those can be some of the biggest discoveries, out there. So I think it's worth really assuming no knowledge. I try to do this with all this work, but I guess the things we're talking about, because they're kind of experiential, if you haven't experienced altered states of consciousness and you haven't done the kind of legwork yourself, you can still be left having no idea what we're talking about here. I get that from family who kindly watch the videos and find it hard to kind of follow along. But I guess I'm trying my best to not leave anyone behind. Next we had this wonderful conversation with an anonymous ex-police officer from the UK, who I'd been corresponding with, and again, off the back of the Black Lives Matter protests, wanted to talk about his experience as a police officer and undergoing psilocybin therapy in the Netherlands, and discovering his own unconscious kind of racist, like how systemic racism had affected him in the way that he policed communities in England. And that was really great. We had a really wonderful conversation. We've corresponded since, and he's a really valuable voice, I think, very intelligent, reflective and thoughtful and compassionate. And if you've not listened to that episode, I'd really recommend it. I think these are exactly the kind of conversations we need to have. It's the kind of headspace we need to be in as a society, with that level of awareness and self-reflection and being able to own these things that are quite difficult to talk about. And I hope to do more of that in the new year. I'm sure that will make lots of people angry, and I'll lose a lot of followers, whatever. But I think it's important to, I don't think society is going to get anywhere good unless we start having these conversations in a better way. And if I'm not willing to try to do that, then I can't claim that everyone else should be doing it. Okay. So next we had Robert Wright, author of Why Buddhism is True, talking about kind of a scientific understanding of Buddhist psychology in terms of evolutionary psychology. I think I basically agree with, as far as I remember, most of what we spoke about. And maybe the kind of subtle difference is, I think I'm right in saying that Robert was inspired by the work of Jerry Fodor, who's a really important cognitive neuroscientist who came up with this. He wrote a book, I think it was called The Modularity of Mind, and this idea that the mind and the brain are kind of parceled into different modules for different tasks, which is a powerful idea. And so he was kind of casting a lot of this stuff in terms of, you have, say you have a module for mind wandering, and it's there because it helped you survive evolutionarily, but it's not perhaps serving you well today, and so you can learn to relate to those modules differently. I tend to think in terms of like a different kind of tradition, I guess, in thinking about the mind, which is kind of complexity theory and systems theory, and thinking about the whole organism as this like decentralized system, which you can also use that lens to think about Buddhist psychology. Perhaps I'll write something about that in the new year. So then we had Erica Dick, who's this wonderful lecturer, professor of the history of Medicine in Canada, and we spoke about the history of psychedelic psychiatry, LSD in particular, which was really fascinating. Again, I feel like it's nice just to start from the beginning, and especially if you're someone who hasn't thought about why psychedelics are illegal, it can be astounding to know that there were successful medical trials back in the 50s and 60s, and to look into the kind of in the new year I'll be talking about the politics as well as to why the war on drugs happened and why psychedelics aren't legal. So then we had Gail Bradbrook, speaking of more controversial political stuff, although I can't believe that the idea of the ecology, like the idea of ecological systems failure and damaging our environment in which we live, the idea that that's political to me is just wild. I would have thought that, in my heart, I feel like I would have thought that that's something we could all just take even a selfish interest in your own survival, in your own, if your own house is on fire. And it makes me think about just how much kind of emotional volatility there is out there that makes people not interested or not take seriously these ideas. But I got a lot of dislikes and nasty comments on those videos, directed at Gail, not me, really, in general. And yeah, she's really putting herself on the front lines with this stuff, which I really respect. Okay, and then Bill Richards, that was a wonderful conversation. Yeah, Bill really is a kind of a through line back to the first wave of psychedelic research in the 60s, and has a wonderful book, Sacred Medicine, I think it's called. And he was just, I really like his energy as well. He just comes across as a very kind of warm, nice guy. We spoke a lot about kind of really tried to hit the whole kind of overview of what the psilocybin experience is about, mystical experiences in general. That was great. Maybe I'll listen back to that one today. Another big hitter, we had Dennis Mckenna. Again, I was really thrilled that these people were willing to come on the podcast. When I started it, I'd hoped, I'd planned to invite these people, and I think I didn't reflect on it kind of explicitly, but I think I'd kind of hope this is like the best case scenario, I guess. The fact that all these people were just willing to make the time, willing to have a conversation, it was really great. And maybe some part of me thought maybe it'd be 50-50, maybe a minority of people would make the time, but the fact that the majority did was really wonderful. And I'm going to keep the momentum going in the new year as well with these kinds of guests. So we spoke about psilocybin and DMT, place in nature, which I think is a really grounding way to think about what these things are, especially with DMT, because it's such a weird alien experience, and yet it kind of, you can extract it from, kind of everyday plants. There's a real kind of enigma going on there that hasn't been solved as to why these things exist in nature and why they have the effectiveness that they do. That's also something I'm planning to work on in the new year. The kind of theory of psychedelic action based in what the serotonin 2A pathway that it acts on, what it might be doing kind of naturally in the human or the mammalian nervous system. So next we had Francoise Bozat. So Francoise has been spent a long time training in kind of traditional psilocybin mushroom use in Mexico, and there's a real wealth of knowledge. He has this wonderful book, Consciousness Medicine, which is kind of like an encyclopedia of the kind of experiences and issues that might come up with these medicines. So I feel it's interesting when I first became interested in psychedelics, it was through the mainstream medical research, and then once you start kind of working with them, a lot of people I think I've seen, they can shift your thinking in a more kind of holistic, interconnected way, and you start to kind of, when you're giving a psilocybin pill in a controlled experiment, even though the effects are not reductionistic, there's some reductionist assumption there. You've extracted the psilocybin, you're giving the chemical, and you're trying to control it and just be like, just this variable. But then when you actually undergo these experiences, you realize the kind of healing happens when you understand yourself as deeply interconnected to everything, in your immediate environment, your social environment, the world, nature, all of these things you're connected to and your relationship often needs to be changed with them if you're going to heal from whatever it is you're trying to heal from. And so those kinds of insights can really make you appreciate that the kind of indigenous use of these things, the ceremony, the traditional knowledge and approach to delivering them are not superfluous. They're not kind of cultural packaging that can be dismissed. We really need to integrate and get back to the kinds of shamanic community healing that seems to have existed, throughout a lot of human cultures before modern civilization. So yeah, I spoke about this to a few people in my episodes, but I'd really like to see kind of community centers almost, where people are allowed to grow these things themselves and are free to work with them in kind of group sessions, and allow a kind of a bottom-up culture of responsible use and to emerge, rather than having to have everything top-down regulated, and you can only get it from your GP if you have depression and these kinds of things. I trust that, and we see this in the underground. People know how to share information on how to do things responsibly. There are people know how to guide. Obviously, there's bad practices as well, but you have people calling out those bad practices, and someone like Rob from Adeptus Psychonautica does amazing work in this area, kind of calling out irresponsible use, bad practices, and what he's doing is exactly what we need. I think we need a bottom-up movement where we're not being irresponsible. We're not just saying anyone can take this, and we wouldn't be criminalizing use, but there'd be strong kind of compassionate social pressure to do these things in a responsible way and to support each other. That's the kind of the main way I'd like to see these things being delivered. I do find it slightly depressing that there are so many startups, biotech companies tweaking psychedelics, trying to make slightly different psychedelics that they can patent, that have slightly different effects, getting rid of hallucinogenic effects. It seems very misguided to me. There's huge amounts of money sloshing around. And if psilocybin mushrooms were legal to grow oneself, it's the most cost-effective approach to mental health care imaginable, and physical health care as well. I found incredible physical improvements after I dealt with the psychological issues that were causing the physical symptoms. So I just think there could be such a huge improvement in health in a way where money doesn't have to corrupt it. But obviously we live in a system where that seems inevitable. So, there are good people. There's a magazine called Symposia with a PSY at the front that does good work, kind of keeping an eye on the kind of the corporatization of psychedelics. It's frustrating that's the way it has to, in our society. It's probably going to actually get pushed forward, but it's the world we live in, unfortunately. And the best we can do is try to keep having conversations about it and push forward to have our own kind of free use as well alongside it. Next, Fridtjof Capra. So this was a huge conversation for me because I think, apart from on the topic of consciousness, although maybe I convinced him, I think we really agree on pretty much everything. He's someone who, when I first read his books, I felt like I was reading myself talking back to me. He writes in a very similar way. I recognize. I feel like he has the same thing of start from the beginning, right? Try to write as clearly as possible, and I find it really thrilling to read his work because it's like I could go away and try and read stuff, and the kind of work I do for this channel and for my writing and my academic work, and then you synthesize it and you try to come out with this pure synthesis of the core points. And with him, I feel like it's someone with a very similar mind to mine who's done all that legwork, and then I can read the distillation. So yeah, he's someone I really respect, and was so thrilled that he was up for a conversation. And not only that he was up for a conversation, but that he read my paper and wanted to talk about my theory, and that was just a real highlight of the year for me. If you've not listened to that conversation, I really recommend it. He's someone really worth checking out, and he has his own online course on the systems view of life that I really recommend. I've not done it, but I would like to. So next we have Blm Wallace. So when I first kind of turned to, I guess, religious literature to make sense of my personal experience with kind of, this kind of spiritual experience I had as a teenager, I've mentioned on here before that the Tibetan Book of the Great Liberation was the text I found first that really resonated. And that talks about the Dzogchen teachings of Tibetan Buddhism. And following from that, there are several teachers that I listened to talking about those teachings, and I really felt like, yes, this is the framework that really resonates with what I experienced. One of those teachers was Blm Wallace, who's an incredibly lucid teacher, has a wonderfully soothing voice as well. There's also Lama Surya Das, who's great. He has a really thick Brooklyn accent, which is I also really enjoy. Brooklyn, New York, I don't know, somewhere in New York, I think, Long Island. And so we spoke about Dzogchen. We don't agree on. He is interested in the idea that there can be kind of like past lives and reincarnation, and that the mind is some kind of flow that underlies all of this phenomena of this life. And so that's something I didn't push back on. I let him kind of offer his perspective there. Again, I leave it up to you. I don't want to presume that I'm right and that I should shut people down and stop you all having the privilege of hearing another perspective. You can make up for yourselves if you agree with him or not. But yeah, I really enjoyed that conversation. And then another great one next was Brian Morescu. We really hit it off. It was wonderful talking to him. I suspect we'll be collaborating at some point in the future as well. But yeah, so he's the author of The Immortality Key, this huge bestseller that came out this year. Wonderful look at the history of psychedelic use in religion in ancient Greece and Christianity. Really, really good book. Like there are a lot of books of people speculating about psychedelic use in history, and he really approaches it in a very kind of scholarly way. But the book's just really fun to read as well. He's a great writer. He reads it himself in the Audible book, and that's how I listened to it. It was great. It's a great narrative. He kind of travels over the world, speaking to people about finding evidence of this. Yeah, I really recommend it. And I'm looking forward to seeing what this is his first book, so I'm looking forward to seeing what he gets up to in future. And then, next we had Michelle Baker-Jones of the Imperial Research Team, Psychedelic Research Team. That was a wonderful conversation, and maybe the one I've had the most positive feedback about. People seem to really enjoy that. And yeah, we just kind of went through psychedelic psychotherapy. We didn't go through it. We spoke about it. And yeah, the research on psilocybin as a treatment for depression. Alongside the kind of clinical work, Michelle has a private practice where, and also is interested in kind of integration and runs integration group. So she's really connected to. She's not just delivering it through this one modality, of like you just have the sessions. She's interested, and really thoughtful on all of these interrelated topics. And so I'm planning to I've got some similar conversations lined up in the new year. So hopefully you'll enjoy those. So then next we have Rupert Spiro. Rupert's someone else who, when I was listening to lectures from and reading books by teachers who, on kind of Dzogchen's a kind of Buddhist non-dual perspective. And non-duality comes from Advaita Vedanta, this Hindu school, which is what Rupert teaches. And so I came across his work back then as well. He's also someone with a very nice soothing voice, and he has a real he's lovely to listen to. He has a real kind of clarity, and he's very good at communicating. Like he has the thing he wants to communicate, and he says it as precisely as he can. There's no pretense or pomp I enjoy that kind of laser like trying to help people just kind of get to these insights. And it's funny as well because in the conversation, the majority of the conversation, we completely agree about the nature of consciousness in terms of how it's experienced and the qualities it has and these kinds of things. And then when it gets to our model, the kind of intellectual understanding of how reality hangs together, we disagree. He thinks it's only consciousness, it's kind of like a dream, and all of this is just a kind of appearance in that dream. Whereas, I have a more traditional scientific worldview where consciousness emerges secondary to this stuff, this process that you might call matter, to get back to that issue. And yeah, he got a bit prickly at the end when we started touching on that, because I think he's had very ungenerous or like very kind of debatey kind of arguments with materialists in the past. And as you said in the podcast, I think he was very pleasantly surprised that I was not invested in arguing or having my position win in any sense. I wanted him to make his case, and I can make mine. And if you shut someone down like that, you're also, I would be not doing myself a service of seeing if I could be convinced by their arguments. So I'm really glad. I'm really happy with how that went. Next we had Charles Eisenstein. Charles is also someone who. So I had this idea for a book where on kind of the psychology of human civilization, starting from, the idea is kind of like, you look at other animals that live in a kind of flow state, in the kind of embedded in nature, and they don't have the kind of mental health issues, that we have, as these kind of things that have pulled apart from nature. And so I was planning to write this thing, trying to trace this kind of line of like, well, what are the things that happen to get us to this alienated point we're at now, and what can we do to kind of come back to feeling more connected to the world and more balanced and at peace. And that would be to do with kind of language being a step in terms of alienating, moving into symbolic thought, pulling away from the world. This relates to meditation, agriculture, dominating nature, all this kind of stuff. And then I found Charles's work, and he has this book called The Ascent of Humanity, where he'd written the kind of book that I wanted to write, in a sense. There are differences, but it was wonderful to come across that. We spoke about that kind of stuff, the history of civilization, and these kind of wisdom traditions, what spirituality can kind of, the lens that they can offer. Because I think it's incredibly relevant. I think if you try and understand suffering in society and at the individual level through any other lens, they're always more superficial than these kinds of understanding our kind of unity with the world, separation, so how suffering comes into existence, alienation. All these things are at the bottom, I think, of suffering at all these scales. It was great to talk to him. He's someone who I actually think, so we agree on the problem, I think, in large part, but his picture of the worldview that would replace the existing one, I have a different one, I think. So in our conversation, he was kind of saying, that this view where like the universe has a purpose, it's going somewhere, and also that it's kind of intelligent. There's an intelligence that is kind of willful, like the source from which we came intelligently decided to go and get lost. This is sounds very similar to Rupert Spiro's kind of view of the universe as consciousness exploring itself. And so that's not my view. My view is like, this is all just happening. It's kind of just tumbling, and it's kind of meaningless and purposeless in a really freeing, liberating, joyous way. If you want to find someone who has a similar worldview to me and this, I'd say Alan Watts is someone who, talks about Taoism, and in Taoism there's this, the fact that there is no ultimate meaning, the fact that everything's just happening, everything's just playing itself. To me, that's the most wonderful thing about reality. It's just going to keep doing this play forever. Even after this universe, we get to the kind of heat death of the universe, presumably after some expanse of infinity, something else will happen, and stuff will just keep happening in these kind of lawful ways, as we described by science. And what we are is just some moment of the kind of eyes opening on the universe and just witnessing this play. And so I don't think there's purpose, and I don't think there's that we're on some quest that we intentionally went on. I think we've stumbled down some neurotic pathological avenue, and that there's no guarantee we'll find our way out, but that once we reach a certain crisis, I think learning from the way people really usually have to most people won't go into this kind of shadow side and into the darkness inside themselves to heal unless they've exhausted every other option. And I think that seems to be quite a common feature of human psychology. So unfortunately, I do suspect that we're going to have to hit some real extreme crisis point as a civilization before we decide it's time to start behaving more sensibly, or take actions, that are more rational and in line with flourishing and well-being. But expect more on that in the new year. Okay, so then we've got 4 more, I think, episodes. So we had Rabbi Zach, which was great. We also really hit it off. I'm sure we'll collaborate in the future. So I mentioned in the episode that in my psychedelic healing journey, I found that the majority of my trauma came from one line of my family. I mean, I shouldn't say the majority, but a huge, important part of it came from a grandparent who was Jewish but had hidden their Jewishness from us up until I was in my mid to late 20s, was when I found out. And I kind of realised that their trauma of the kind of anti-Semitism of, that they experienced around the Second World War, had led to such kind of shame that this is something, you don't casually hide part of your heritage. It's something that's where the culture kind of, there's all this shame and coming at you, and it's very traumatic, and so it gets suppressed, and then this trauma can kind of be passed down, and I had to really reckon with a lot of that. And so I have an interest in, I guess, the Jewish experience and how psychedelic medicine can be used to help with that, because obviously Jewish communities have faced incredible amounts of trauma since, I don't have to go through, the Holocaust and the pogroms of Russia, which another great grandparent was in. And I mean, I've got a book I've been reading after my conversation with Zach. It's called Shaviti, A Vision. It's about a concentration camp survivor who underwent LSD psychotherapy in the 70s in Holland. And it was the doctor who first identified concentration camp syndrome, what was called survivor syndrome. It's a kind of form of what we would call PTSD, and was successfully treating people with LSD. And, it really brings home the horror of the injustice that these things were made illegal, that people knew that you could heal PTSD, you could treat people who were suffering, had been suffering for decades with flashbacks and anxiety and depression from having gone through concentration camps. And we could have been treating these people, but we didn't, for political reasons. This highly irrational, approach to using drug policy to demonize certain communities was prioritized over health. And that's really, I think that's a powerful avenue into talking about political stuff. There's too much to say on that topic. So then I actually also have later this week a piece that's coming out on Reality Sandwich on psychedelics and Judaism. It's like a huge piece where I'm just trying to explore all the different topics there. So if that's of interest, even if you have no connection to Judaism, I'd recommend checking it out. I also may as well get in my brag about my Jewish heritage, because I'm currently in Portugal, where I technically have a right to return, because I can trace my ancestry on that side back to the Portuguese Jews in the 16th century who were forced out during the Inquisition, and they went to Amsterdam, where there's this very small community of a few hundred Portuguese Jews who were very self-contained, and one of the people in that community was Spinoza, hugely important philosopher whose kind of worldview I agree with. He's kind of the first atheist, but he's an atheist in the way I'm an atheist, in that he kind of thought nature was God. Like, it's kind of pantheistic view. There is no separate creator God, but reality is kind of sacred or divine. But my 12th great-grandfather, called Abraham Barzilay, he was one of the elders who excommunicated Spinoza for his atheism. So even though my family, I assume, has been kind of on the wrong side of that debate, it's quite cool to have this direct line. He has the same last name as this grandparent, so it's real father 12 times. Getting a little kind of claim to fame there. So then with Joseph Goldstein, someone else who, when I was kind of forming my thoughts about what wisdom traditions kind of fit with my experience I had as a teenager, Joseph was someone who I found incredibly useful. He teaches Vipassana, kind of mindfulness-based meditation, which is not a tradition. I was really going for these kinds of non-dual insight kind of states, or at least trying to kind of cultivate that. And the good thing with Joseph is he's very familiar with that as well. He had a similar kind of awakening experience early on, And then we both spoke about how following that you can try to kind of integrate through mindfulness, rather than try to build up to it through mindfulness. And I actually think, I didn't ask him about this, but I think psychedelics, more and more people these days are having non-dual experiences through psychedelics. And so I think this approach could really work, for in that framework as well. That you have these big experiences, then you need to kind of integrate them. We spoke about this Korean Zen teacher called Chinul, who had a book called Tracing Back the Radiance, which is all about this idea of you have the big experience and then you try and integrate it. Okay, the last two. So then we have Joe B. Brown, who I came across at this conference in London, Breaking Convention, and he mentioned that he'd just moved to Portugal, and he lives like an hour from where we live. So I thought it'd be good to get him on. And he has a book called with his wife on the idea that it's called the Psychedelic Gospels, on the idea that there are mushrooms in Christian art, psychedelic mushrooms, and that there might be some kind of hidden legacy of mushroom use. Some of the pictures really do look like psychoactive mushrooms, but I'm left kind of with a feeling of like frustration. You can't really prove it. There's a lot of kind of debate about it. People very, very strong opinions on both sides. And I just kind of walk away from the conversation because maybe my scientific mindedness is like, well, neither of these arguments are going to meet the burden of proof that I would require. And also there doesn't seem to be any kind of reason to believe there was any serious sacramental use. So, I don't think the bread and wine was kind of was psilocybin mushrooms and mushroom drink or something, anything like that. So it was interesting talking to him about it. And then finally we have Lawrence Millman, who I found Lawrence. I was looking for someone who could talk about Amanita muscaria, this kind of red and white mushroom, and the connection to Siberian shamanism in Lapland and the Arctic in general, and Christmas. And I found a piece he'd written and immediately recognised that I'd read a book of his about a decade earlier called A Kayak Full of Ghosts, which is a wonderful collection of short stories by kind of people in the Arctic, like traditional stories. He was great to talk to. He also said that he'd be interested in coming to the land and doing kind of mushroom workshops. We have Amanita growing here in December, so maybe that's something we'll do in future. That was a really fun conversation as well. That brings us up to the end of the year. I won't reflect on this episode as I'm doing it. The Ask Me Anythings have been a really positive presence as well, I think. As I mentioned, the questions have been excellent. I've almost used it as a way, instead of doing the solo episodes to camera, I thought, well, at this point, I've got enough of my material out there that people can ask me to fill in or clarify certain things, and that will allow me to go off on these tangents. But perhaps I'll return to doing, reflecting more on kind of meditation and stuff like that, because that's harder to kind of ask questions about. It's easier to ask questions about, well, I say easier to ask questions about my theory. It's a lot of legwork to read the paper or try and understand any scientific theory. But there's more to wrestle with in terms of the rational mind. So maybe I will do some more kind of to camera stuff. So I mentioned in the new year I'm going to be working on this article for the journal Entropy, my theory of kind of psychedelic action, which I've been sitting on since, I think I came up with it August of last year, so that's like a year and a half almost. So I really need to get it out. But I'm hesitant because any kind of scientific explanation runs the risk of reducing the experience in some way, and I really don't want to do that because I don't think they should be reduced. I don't think they are like meaningless hallucinations. But my kind of take home is they tell you they're coming from within. That's my kind of position. They're not telling you, the consciousness only view. A lot of the time is that your consciousness is genuinely exploring other, parts of consciousness in the universe. Whereas I'm saying it's self-contained, but it's coming from your evolutionary programming. So you're getting in touch with stuff that's outside of you, your like rational mind, and your like identity. You're getting in touch with stuff that's coming from deep past. But it's not, there's no kind of supernatural reconfiguring that needs to happen. So to the extent to which people get meaning from thinking they're contacting some realm, some kind of spirit realm, then I'd be arguing against that. And I don't like, I don't want to kind of rain on people's, interpretations where they get meaning. So I think that's partly what's holding me back, but I'll power through and get it out there. So yeah, and then 2021, hoping to wrap up the accommodation here, and then hopefully have people visit in 2022. So hopefully see some of you then. Hope you've all had a great holiday and have a wonderful new year, and I'll see you in the new year.